Good evening, viewers. Welcome to Zoom In, where I am absolutely stoked to have an incredible lineup of legal minds tonight. And we're talking all things diversity and exclusion rather than inclusion. Obviously, topical are the issues around George Floyd. We've seen corporates and governments, we've seen individuals all across the globe respond to an incident that was quite harrowing and quite shocking, quite frankly. Shocking to some, usual to others who've been through this in various guises. So we thought it might be a good idea to get a legal perspective of what diversity and inclusion should be and what reality on the ground is for most people in the workplace. On tonight's show, I am absolutely honored to have Mucha Nyandoro, who you've seen before. She's our judge, who I've coined her our resident guest for our Zoom In shows on all things legal. We've got Tenji Moyo, who too you've seen before on the show. She's a legal director in the UAE and she co-heads employment at Firm, a global law firm based out of Dubai. We've got Sarah Malik, who's the CEO, and she is an International Disputes Counsel. She's got her organization called Soul. And of course, we've got Otilia Piri, who is a attorney at Microsoft. So she's a commercial attorney. She does a lot of stuff around diversity and inclusion as well. So ladies, welcome. So excited to have you on board.
Well, thanks for inviting us. And I'm really excited to be part of this very esteemed panel. So hopefully it's going to be interactive and we'll be able to answer questions the viewers will have and have a good, lively, interactive discussion.
I'm excited to join the panel. It's very topical at the moment. We've been doing a lot of work in this space. So yeah, as in quite eager to share, as in some experiences as well and hear what others are doing.
Thank you, Mucha, for inviting me back. I think offline and online, we always talk about anything and everything to do with Black Lives Matter and what's happening in the news. So it's really great to be with this panel. I'm fortunate to know everybody personally, and I wouldn't have selected a better crew to be with. So excited to go through this topic with you guys today.
We're getting sentimental before we've even started. We adore you too, Tenji. And of course, and that's I.
Well, I'm absolutely honoured to be invited back. And you know what, I sound like a broken record when I say, well, we keep it real on these panels. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. That's close to my heart. So yes, I am looking forward to hearing what the panelists have to say and from engaging with our audience as well. So enjoy.
Wonderful. So audience, we like to hear from you. Please let us know from off the bat if there are any questions that you want answered, if there are any observations, any thoughts that you have, feel free to share because we'd love to get your perspectives on stuff as well. Right, so I thought it might be a good idea to frame this discussion by starting off with a basic description of what diversity and inclusion should look like. So from a legal perspective, what is the whole idea behind diversity and inclusion? As we've got an employment specialist, Tenji, I might start off with you for this one.
I think this question has been asked so many times, and I think diversity and inclusion is really about having diversity of thoughts, different ages, people of different religions, backgrounds in one organization. I think very often you walk into a workforce or an industry and you see it either being very male heavy or female heavy, depending on the organization. So it would be typical to walk into, say, a nursery and just find women, middle-aged women of a certain race in that nursery. So it's really just having a mixed bag of cultures, qualifications, ages, and that is what diversity and inclusion would, in my view, would deem to be.
Is there a distinction between diversity and inclusion? Because I think most people would think, well, it's one and all the same thing. If you've got a diverse workforce, surely it's an inclusive workforce. What's the technical view on this? Perhaps I'll pass that one to Sarah.
Yeah, thanks. No, diversity is, I agree with everything Tenji said. It's just about appreciating people bring different things to the table depending on various factors, human factors, race, ethnicity, nationality, age, disability. That's about being diverse. But being inclusion is when those people are then empowered to bring their voice to the table. So it's not just a tick box exercise of we're a diverse organization because we represent the masses. Inclusion is actually empowering those people to have a voice, to actually be involved with the decision making. And the two are very separate concepts, but the main thing for me, for a diverse and inclusive workforce is if you don't have one, as a company, forget everything else, you yourself miss out. If you're not representative of the demography of the population, if you're not having women's points of view or people who have a certain age group or people of a certain ethnicity, your company itself is stale and stagnatic. How can you say you're exercising best practice, putting all discrimination aside, putting employees to side. If these voices are not heard, you're not making decisions that may even drive your own business forward, because you're not inclusive and you're not representative of the makeup of those masses you're seeking to hit. So inclusion is really important. Diversity is a starting point, and inclusion is to ensure that it's not just paid lip service to.
And I think what we normally find is this idea that actually we've got leadership teams that have got or paid huge sums of money to consultants, for instance, to understand what their demographic is, what their catchment is. As a result, I'm not always convinced that much time or effort is put into, one, ensuring that you've got diverse leadership teams that then represent the masses, as you quite rightly point out, which then means that organizations are missing out on a segment of potential business because they're not tapping into it adequately. Ottilia, you've worked different markets and you might have a view from Microsoft's perspective, for instance. What do you see happening in the workplace around diversity and inclusion?
So I might start off by sharing a little bit of my experience from Microsoft, because I feel like there's a lot of stuff that we've been working on over the last, it predates even when I landed at Microsoft. And I think it's a good example of some of the steps that corporates are taking. So I will share a little bit on the Microsoft perspective. I think essentially for us, it started off as a journey of changing culture, because I think the one thing that became very clear is that we speak a lot about diversity, we speak about inclusion, but at the center of it, it's about human experience, right? And how humans interact. And essentially, it's about the type of culture you want to have in your organization. And so perhaps the early steps were defining what's the culture we want to have, what are the values that the company wants to espouse, and what are the things that we're going to hold each and every person that we bring into this organization to, right? And so that was probably like the first steps of shaping what our diversity and inclusion agenda would look like. And then the next thing, I think, was there was some required training to kind of get everyone in a level set, basic understanding of certain principles, whether it's actually the principle we started with was unconscious bias. And the conversation was around, look, the truth is all of us have some sort of unconscious or inherent biases that come as a result of our experiences, how we're raised, the schools we went to, the neighborhoods we lived in, the culture we were raised in, the country we were, so many things, right? So that we started with the common understanding that we all have biases. What are they and how do they come up? And perhaps let's put a mirror to ourselves, each as an individual in the organization, and kind of get a sense of what those unconscious biases might be like. So that was the early stages. And then we then started to dip our waters a little bit into more complex conversations. I remember we had a training that we also did globally that was called Dialogue Across Differences. And this was a little bit of, that uncomfortable conversations that we don't want to have. The ones about, what are the issues in our markets? What are some of the race dynamics we see, for example, in the region that I'm in, that I cover in Middle East and Africa? What are some of the race dynamics we see in a place like South Africa? How does that play out in the corporate setting? What are some of the conversations we should be having? And it was interesting how that one was received. There were people who really liked it because it made you uncomfortable. It made you kind of face, some of the things that you probably dealt with day to day, but never spoke about out loud. But then there were those people who felt targeted in many ways, like we're seeing today online, people who feel like when you have a conversation about privilege, you're attacking them. So there were, it was very interesting how that was received. But we've kind of progressed along and have different programs and initiatives that we're running. But I'll maybe land here with the more recently in light of the recent global phenomenon following George Floyd murder, really. I don't know if we should, death, killing, however you want to put it. The company has been not just decisive about making a public statement around Black Lives Matter, but have actually made some concrete commitments around steps that they're going to take to ensure better representation of ethnic minorities, starting off, of course, with the Black and African American community who, this has come to the forefront for many reasons. So they have some concrete commitments around leadership representation that they want from ethnic minorities, commitments that over the next coming years, how they're going to build pipe and a talent pipeline to ensure that you do then have people progressing into those roles, et cetera, et cetera. The point is there's a lot of things that are happening in this space from a corporate perspective. And to be fair, I see a lot of our peers, at least in the tech space, do very similar things. That's why I thought it was a good example. to share.
Okay, no, thanks for that. And my observation has been there's a lot of talk shops. So we all know corporate websites, intranet sites, and so forth that have got the most compelling arguments about diverse and inclusive workforces. Throw in some statistics and it all looks very impressive. But for people who are actually within those organizations, even a case such as George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement still continues to tease out things that I'm not sure have been adequately addressed. Do we predict that there'll be a marked difference between the pre-George Floyd and post-George Floyd era in the way that corporates embrace diverse entities?
Well, do you know, this is a very interesting topic because as the panelists and I were discussing earlier before we went live, in the United Kingdom, for instance, because I can only speak to the laws in the United Kingdom, we've had from 1975, you know, the Sex Discrimination Act, for instance, 1976, the Race Relations Act, and the Disability Discrimination Act, I think, was 1995. And this all culminated into the Equality Act of 2010, which brought all of these together. So the starting point for me, from a legal perspective, is always in any constitutional democracy and in upholding the rule of law, protecting the rights and freedoms of everyone and promoting equality under the law is of paramount importance. And when you think about it, every single person within any jurisdiction should enjoy equal protection under the law, and whoever's subject to the law should be entitled to its protection as well. So when you start looking at the events that have played out recently, what the law should do, and the law aims to do, is to be blind to differences between individuals who come to the courts, and to promote a representation of all within society. Now, this doesn't always happen. Now, the difficulty I have in particular is obviously I can't speak to what should be happening in as much as law enforcement is concerned and in as much as what's going out on the streets is concerned. But what is really important in my perspective, is to ensure that there is a balanced representation of those who are in law enforcement, for instance, and those who are involved in applying the laws from Parliament, so that society feels a connection to those who enforce the law. I'd heard it being said in other jurisdictions that there is a contract with society, it becomes broken if one aspect of society feels it's not protected by the laws that should exist to protect absolutely everyone. I think with the level of discussion that's going on with recent events, there is going to be sort of upping the ante in relation to all of the laws that exist in various constitutions. And as I said earlier, you've had the Equality Act in the United Kingdom, which was passed in 2010. And that sought to abolish discrimination in relation to age, gender, disability, race, religion, belief, or sexual orientation, amongst other things. And there are various types of discrimination that people have to deal with. But then you also have the issue of institutional discrimination in various different aspects of society. So just going back to the legal profession, for instance, now with the bar, because I practiced as a barrister before I was appointed, and I can only speak to the changes that took place as far as the bar is concerned, there are professional bodies that control the activities of barristers. And we have the Bar Standards Board, for instance, which has a duty to ensure equality and diversity when it comes to the legal profession. And it supports chambers to ensure, for instance, that you have in all sets of chambers an equality and diversity officer, so that should anyone come to need representation when it comes to dealing with events in society, they aren't going to be discriminated against in terms of their personal profile, and they should have the understanding that they're going to have adequate representation regardless of their individual profile, and that the law is there to protect them when the protection is required. In relation to the judiciary, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, I touched upon in a previous discussion that we had on the Constitutional Reform Act in 2005 that ensured that the judiciary was representative of society as a whole. So you had a commission that was created to ensure selection of judges on merit, and a diverse panel of judges selected Because although from a legal perspective, we know that the law is blind to everything but the facts, but when you talk about the man on the street or the layperson who doesn't understand how these things work, when they come into an environment and they don't see somebody who looks like them, for instance, and they feel as if they aren't going to get the level of representation or protection as far as the law is concerned, that is a problem.
Natalia, before we even go there is a school of thought, and I'm going to play devil's advocate here today. It's all fair and fine to have these incredible policies and this great foresight about being inclusive. But when you think about the minority that typically requires legal services, they're low income, probably can't afford legal fees. So the whole system is prohibitive to the people who require it most. What does the law do to address that?
Things have changed over the years. Initially, we had we've got legal aid, for instance, that people can have access to in relation to not being on that level playing field and as much as access to justice is concerned. But the public purse has changed over the years, and some legal aid funding has gone down. So that obviously has impacted on the standard of representation, which it shouldn't. That people often have. But I think I'll leave it there for now and hand over to one of my panelists to see if anyone else has a different view to bring to that.
I saw Sarah smiling. I bet she's got something to add to this.
I'm going to disagree with a bit of what's been said. I'm going to be a bit more, I think, I have a different viewpoint, right? So as everybody has been following what's going on in the media, what's going on with all the big companies, whether tech companies, the big corporates, the big sports, everybody's come forward. And number one, made a public statement. Number two, said they're going to donate all of this money, millions to charities or millions to underprivileged or to Black communities. And that's all great. It's fine that we've got the statements and it's fine that we're going to have charitable givings. But where does that translate into reality? What I'd like to see and what I want to see is that translated into what's happening in your boardroom. Are you actually employing the right people for the right job? Are you just paying lip service to your equal opportunities policies? Is somebody tracking what's going on with those policies? Are you going to not just do the right thing and throw a bunch of money and say, now we're done and we've said the right thing? Because that's just hollow and disingenuous in my view. And I think the leadership of organizations have a bigger and higher duty to actually put the money where the mouth is. And if you're going to stand by this, and what I would like to see in 6 months, 9 months is a trajectory of what change has actually hit home on ground level. Let's see your statistics then. Let's see where you were 6 months ago. You've made these pledges, you're going to spend all this money. Now, that may or may not happen. To me, in terms of representation, there needs to be a more open access, and whether there's the government or other people in different jurisdictions, make some kind of merit tested or means tested, or even some kind of free advice or otherwise that people can access. And if need to be, they can supplement those lawyers who are giving it, even on a kind of encourage them to say, you know what, lawyers, we want you to give 5 hours or 10 hours. Certainly, I remember when I was practicing at the bar in the UK, we were always encouraged to do pro bono work, for example, for those who were perhaps less fortunate financially. Now, I don't see why people shouldn't be able to access advice, even if they can't afford it, and that needs to be put into practice. That's a good measure to take. So I'm waiting to see the actual changes that play. And to me, organizations should do things like, you know what, let's anonymize CVs. I don't care who's applying. I don't care whether his name's Joe Blogg, Sarah Malik, or Oko Endo. I don't care whether he's male, female. I don't care where they're from. Do they have the right skill set? Are they going to make the interview? And I think you'd be hugely surprised then when they look at statistics for the companies of those who made their way through the front door to begin with, and those who made their way through the front door to interviews once these anonymized objective policies are put into place. So I think a lot needs to be done. We're at the very beginning of the change, but I just hope it's not superseded by another distraction in a few weeks, which often happens, unfortunately. So that's my take on where we're at.
Sure, and I was actually I can't agree with you more, but talk to this idea of short-termism and these big initiatives, right? So whilst everyone is on lockdown or you've got restricted services, a lot of time and effort can be paid on issues such as this. At the point that your bottom line becomes your core function, because economies have opened up, society has opened up again, the cynic in me suggests that it then just becomes that thing we talked about during COVID-19 or just after George Floyd passed on. So it would be really good to see some longevity in a lot of these policies. And as we quite rightly point out, measurable. People must be held accountable for the commitments that they make. And I think it should be in the public domain as well, what companies have actually done. Tenji, what would your view be on this?
No, I just really want to add on to what Sarah has mentioned about, taking active steps. And it's been great in terms of some of the inquiries that we've received from leading companies, asking for some advice as, okay, what do we do to be better? So we've seen the blind CVs, and I think it's quite uncomfortable. So certainly we know of the postcode lottery or what school you went to. There are just certain comfort zones that organizations have. I think last time I was on, I spoke about getting to the last round of an interview process, and the last question was to see whether you're a good cultural fit. And what does that mean? So where companies are actually changing their policy to say, okay, we are unconsciously biased. What are we going to do about it? Fine, we're going to have blind CVs, blind interviews, and see what type of people come through the door. And now you're looking at actual skills. What can a person offer, not where do they go to school? So often, particularly in law firms, I mean, I spoke about, being in London, looking at the leading law firms and seeing all the partners didn't look like. And already that gives a student like me the discouragement. They just feel that they're unable to make it in the legal world. So what we need to see is absolutely more representation and targets. If your pay packet is actually, you get an extra bonus because you have hit the targets, then leadership will be more motivated to do that. Right now, it's great to say, oh, we're bringing in a more diverse workforce, but what are your targets? Are you actually bringing in a more diverse workforce? I do know that some firms have actually said a certain percentage of their board will be women. A certain percentage of their board will be Black women. And I think until we make those controversial moves, will we make a difference? And then there becomes a question, is it just window dressing? Are you just there to tick the box? And there is that danger. There is that danger that I have been appointed to the board and perhaps I'm just a window dresser. So there needs to be a balance, but I do think specific intentional measures, training on discrimination, on what is discrimination, on what is unconscious bias, and what have we done? And as Sarah said, after 6 months, where were we? Where are we now? One of the initiatives that they brought in at my firm, which I benefited from a lot, was a listening session. So literally employees getting on there and saying, okay, right, so Black Lives Matter movement, tell us your experiences. And, listening to the experiences that lawyers have had, not necessarily in our firm, but maybe in London or when they were a trainee. I remember, listening to one lawyer saying when she was back in the UK, she wears a headscarf and her partner said to her, somebody said to her, oh, you will make it in the arbitration world because it's great. It's a great time for a woman like you, and not because of the skills that she has. So you can get to a point where people say, oh, it's a great time to be a Black woman now, and overlooking the skills that you have. So, it's really important to speak to people, hear the experiences that you've had. I mean, Sarah on panel is a really good friend of mine as well, and we started talking about discrimination. What have you experienced in your life? And I was absolutely gobsmacked, Sarah, when I spoke to you, and you said, oh, actually, not much. I'm like, what? I assumed that you would have so many more issues of discrimination or so many more examples of discrimination. And I think it's really important once you start having those conversations. And the best friends that I have of all races are unafraid to have those real discussions and we can move forward.
Chenji, thank you very much for that. I think there is something to be said about having these quotas, right? Because you break into the boardroom as you do, but then if you're never accepted as an equal and you're never truly included, yes, you've got the diversity, but it's not backed up by anything meaningful for the person who then goes in is failing because they can't thrive in a hostile environment. What then does the law do to support people like that? Because yes, you've got policies, but I keep coming back to this idea, unless you can afford the fee, the legal fees, unless you understand what your rights are, unless policy is clear, people end up just giving up and leaving work or settling for a really uncomfortable employment life, which is quite tragic, really.
Ahead, Hazel, because it's not just what the law does. The responsibility lies within, firstly, with the organisation. Their policies and procedures need to be checked and they need to be robust to ensure that doesn't happen. Just giving an example, it's kind of backtracking, but it's interlinked to what you're saying. We were talking earlier about the kind of cases that may come up now or that have been coming up. There's a really interesting one in the UK that I've been following. It's being run by somebody I know well, his law firm. So there was a bank manager earning very good money in the UK, right? And he'd been not an employment, but a general kind of systematic, if you like, abuse. But the employer didn't stand by him because they didn't have the opportunity to. He was for 26 months, and it's all over LinkedIn, all the press, hounded by the Met Police on the basis of a black man. How do you live in this house? How do you wear that watch? How do you have these two cars? They just didn't, firearms, God knows what allegations they brought against him. Nothing was proven. This went on for 26 months, not one single apology, and suddenly everything's dropped. He was demoted at work, went to a low position. The work's attitude is, well, obviously, because whilst this investigation is ongoing, we can't have him on the premises because, you know, there's all these serious allegations. But the problem there you have is also the internal policies, because employers can turn to organizations, external ones, and say, actually, this goes against what our ethos is and how we protect our people. But employers need to be able to stand up and do that. And I'd like to see more of that. What I do think will happen though now is people feel more empowered to be able to bring their voice forward, hopefully. I hope it's not just a very temporary thing and then there's a few cases and everybody forgets about it. And the companies who are making all the statements and really care will allow that open dialogue that Tenji's spoken to. I was shocked when I spoke to Tenji because she's a very good friend of mine. I had no idea of the level that she'd faced herself as a person. And I would never know that had this not happened and we'd not spoke about things. So the fact, I think, even with companies, they can train themselves by knowing how their own people are affected. Because until they know themselves, and they might not even know what they're doing has the effect on, for example, ethnic minorities, black people, or any other protected or prohibited group, as a prohibited characteristic discrimination. So it's all very well saying, and I think it's correct that they need to have training, etc., but they need to train themselves and educate themselves. And what better way than actually say to your employees and stand by it to say, can you tell us about your experiences? How can we make things better for you? How can we as a company make it, make things better so you feel that you fit in just like I do and we're not differentiated? And it's not probably going to happen in our lifetimes, but my ideal would be one day we never need to have these webinars because it's so accepted that everybody is one, that none of this is ever going to matter again. And I don't know if that's ever going to happen in our lifetime.
And I just want to jump in there, sorry, Hazel, just to clarify, because I think when people talk about discrimination, they're thinking of really massive, big incidents. It's not. So some of the examples Sarah and I were talking about was just simply, I just go into the building and I get asked, where are you going? I've been working there for years. Then I asked her, have you ever been asked, where are you going in this building? And she's like, no, not once. So it's more incidents. And the problem is, as employment lawyers, when we get a discrimination case, they are the most difficult cases to run because discrimination isn't like, oh my gosh, it's small. And the best clients we have are the ones who are able to record instances. They have a diary, they are, they have their appraisals and make sure they were, star performers, and then all of a sudden everything went down. And maybe they've taken note of someone else who was treated differently so they can say, this is my comparator. A white male was also a poor performer, but he wasn't put on a performance improvement plan, but I was. Otherwise, they're very difficult to run. I mean, a discrimination case, if you don't have evidence, we're not going to run it and you're not going to win. And that's the problem. Discrimination is not, oh my gosh, there you go, black woman. No, it's just little subtle incidents. And that's where the issue is.
That's our most recent learning, what you just described, microaggressions. right? As in those little things that are not necessarily overtly discriminatory, but are subtle, and it's a burden that a lot of people carry every day, because you now have to waste a couple of minutes explaining to someone, oh, I work in such and such a place where, for goodness sake, you've been going into that building over and over for how many years. But anyway, I just wanted to give the term for what you just described as microaggression.
Yes. Microaggressions, absolutely.
And because it's so subjective as well, you find that at the point someone does want to raise their hand and raise the alarm, so we talk to the boys like that all the time. So you're either an equal or you're not. As male colleagues, they're able to take it on the chin, they're fine with the banter. Whereas as women, we may not always respond to that banter the same way. And at the point that you want to raise legitimate complaints, they get pushed out, and then you become the troublemaker, the harassment, the bullying, and everything that goes with it begins. So there is an element of futility sometimes in raising these concerns for the average employee.
Yes, so we have to be clear. I think we're talking about quite a few issues here. I completely understand the whole, and I think the term that I've been using is subtle prejudice, where you can't actually point at anything. And in fact, when you're trying to describe something, what's the problem? There is a problem. And it's lots of little incidents. But what I wanted to say is that there are two things that we're talking about: open dialogue. And I'm not an employment law specialist. The last time I did employment law was my final year on my LLB many years ago, so I'm not going to step into any shoes. But there's the open dialogue, which is very, very important in any organisation, in law firms. But there's also this issue with quotas, and I don't want to start digressing at this stage. I have my issue with quotas. I'm sure we might start talking about that later on. But yes, they are very necessary, but I do have issues with them sometimes.
Well, let's talk about it now. What's your issue with it?
So we have to level the playing field. So sometimes quotas are necessary. I've always come back to it should always be about merit, no matter what. For any position, it should be about merit. The difficulty I have with quota systems when they aren't, and this is where the checks and balances come into it. It's all very well to have, equality and diversity officers and organizations. If all they're doing is ticking boxes and responding to the checks and balances, that doesn't work. And so my issue with quotas is they can promote the perception of elevation due to some sort of special dispensation, or being there by accident, or because of your profile and not your skill, if these things aren't applied properly, and then being a token. And I have an issue with being a token. So it's a difficult issue to deal with, and a difficult conversation, not because the answers aren't straightforward, but it's the application of equality and leveling out the playing field without this whole notion of token and, not being competent, but there because we need to tick this box and this person needs to be there. That's not the way it should work at all. So blind CVs, as everyone else said earlier, is something that happens at certain levels in the legal profession, but I don't think every single organisation does that.
But you know what, I often wonder whether if you had 10 blind CVs, 10 Nigerian people come to an interview, right, in London, in New York, I wonder whether that corporate would say, absolutely, you were the best guys for the job, we're taking one of you on board. Or you start to talk about cultural fit, you start to talk about your concerns of having, a dominant race on the floor in the department or wherever it might be. So I think the principle is fantastic. I do wonder how applicable it is end to end. I think it'll get people through the door, but what happens once they get through that door? Will they actually get to sign a contract and be taken on as the best person for the job?
That's where, if you have effective policies and procedures, you need to then be able to say, we had 10 black guys or 10 black women or 10 black people apply for a job, and guess what? Nobody got it. Why? So these policies, you need to check and balance who's applying for you, who's getting through, who's getting to first round, who's getting to second round. And you'll start to understand within your own organization, actually, we have an unconscious bias. We've had the proportion of the applicants we've taken who have succeeded to get the job. If we look at in terms of the applications that came in, it's a tiny minority. We have a problem in the way we're interviewing, and we need to tackle that. So you're absolutely right. It doesn't necessarily get you anywhere past the first base. But having said that, a good organization who pays more than just, the tick box exercise and checks their policies and procedures and checks what's actually happening, will then be able to go to the board and say, we have a problem. And this is why, without giving names or otherwise, but we've had X amount of this race and no one's ever made it past first round. Yet these are, the kind of credentials.
Sarah, I think that's fantastic. This is going to be an industry-specific thing, at least in my world, where this is only effective if you've got an effective HR. So if HR works for the business and HR isn't that independent person who's there to drive the interests of the organization, but they're there to, I guess, appeal to the powers that be or the business side of things, I'm not quite sure that those checks and balances always exist and are as effective as they ought to be.
Management has to empower HR. It's not HR's role. Management has to say, we need to understand who's coming through the door and who's getting to the top. That's coming from the organization, top down. Mm-hmm. So that's what I mean about effective policies and procedures rather than paying lip service to charitable statements and, we support this movement. If HR will do what management tells them to do, end of story. So if management say we are actually now committed to knowing where we're going and what we're doing and how we're tackling this, and we want to know in 6 months or 3 months, or, we want to do a check and balance on what we've been doing, it's for management to do, not for HR. HR needs to be asked to do.
So perhaps HR should be independent of organizations, because I'm not sure that balance is ever going to work effectively, quite frankly. If your bills are being paid by the tone at the top, you're going to go with that tone and nothing's ever going to change, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a space for that, which I think that's a bit cynical.
Yeah.
I think I do think that, training on unconscious bias helps. It makes you think differently. Because I've gone through the training myself, it made me actually, more sensitive to exactly what unconscious bias is and whether you're drawn to people with a similar background as you. But I think we were talking about the name bias. Putting people in front, just getting into the door, is actually half the battle. Sometimes the difficulty for some names, there have been surveys done to say, similar qualifications, same postcode, everything, but an African name and a white name the white name comes with 50% callbacks, I think a report says, as compared to the African sounding name. But sometimes we all know we just need to get in front of the right people. So I'm actually quite happy if the people getting through the door for the interview is diverse. I'm happy with that, because then the skills will come through. If you're good, you're good. And you just need someone to put you in front of the right person. And the rest is history.
Talia, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, there's perhaps two comments. The first one in response to your point about HR being a separate entity or outside of the organization. As an in-house legal counsel, we face the exact same type of dilemma, right? As HR. Support functions are typically sitting in this place where they have to have some sort of independence or an ability to represent multiple stakeholders or views, right? And HR is in the same space. So I wouldn't say necessarily that they need to be outside of the organization, because that would mean we also need to be outside the organization as legal counsel or finance professionals. But the second point I was going to say on this conversation of the recruitment and the blind CVs, there's an interesting thing that we've piloted in certain areas that has been piloted, and we start speaking about a particular company that has been piloted in certain areas where you intentionally recruit for certain diversity dimensions. So as opposed to waiting to see the magic that will happen when when you have blind CVs and then bring people in and hope that you will magically get a diverse slate and then be able to get the diversity dimensions you're looking for within your team, you intentionally set out with those recruitment principles. And that's clearly stated and shared with a panel of people who will be part of the recruitment team, so that it's not an individual or one person making a decision. And that can be cross-functional, including HR, the hiring manager, and maybe other voices as well. And that's a different way of thinking about it. And it goes to the conversation even about the affirmative action or quota. If you're intentionally saying, look, we're an organization that looks like this, what we need to bring in a difference of views and or perspectives into our organization is XYZ, and we're going to intentionally go out and look for that. I just wanted to share that.
Given this context that we've come up with, and this broad spectrum of views around what diversity and exclusion is, what real inclusion looks like, the impact that inclusion has on the bottom line of any organization that's looking to grow, expand into new geographies. Could you all tell me the most shocking discriminatory case that you've heard or experienced in your respective rights? What comes to mind when you think of that thing that might have defined your views of how ineffective policy might be, or I don't know, leadership teams? What kind of gets you going when you think about a specific example?
I mean, I'll just start. I mean, I'll just talk about, I don't have a massive one, but I've dealt with a couple of discrimination matters in my time. And I remember dealing with a lawyer, a female lawyer who had been terminated and was claiming discrimination on the grounds of her race, of her sex. And, it was just all the issues you mentioned, or we spoke about today, banter in the office, comments about her legs when she walked in, massages when she was at her desk, shall I give you a quick massage? It was a toxic, very male-dominated environment, but she was a great lawyer, did really well, and when she was terminated many years after, working for the organization, and that was simply because another partner had come in, took a dislike to her for whatever reason, and she was out the door very quickly. We now had to really go back throughout her career and say, if she was a poor performer, clearly you wouldn't have sent her to your top client and, to represent the firm and just built it all together. But it was extremely difficult. It was a difficult a case to run. But, she had done well in terms of her performance reviews, keeping them, wherever someone had complimented her, and just building the case. But like I said, these discrimination cases are extremely difficult. And what corporates forget is that they are, the legal term is vicariously liable for their employees. So if the management isn't trained or doing anything to protect the health and safety and well-being of the employees, then they're on the hook for it. So good companies actually will want to say, let's do this training, so that they can distance themselves away from the manager or whoever is being accused. So it's in a corporate's best interest to make sure that they're doing they have the policies, they have the training, whatever, because when we send off that dreaded legal notice that they'll say, oh, look, we're a stellar organization. This is what we've done. All our managers go for this training. They know blah, 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 blah. So that's always difficult. And employment is emotional. You get the tears, and and not everyone has the stomach to run a case. You have to have an employee who's like, right, I'm going for it. I don't care. And not everyone is really is able to do that, because it can take months to actually get where we want to go. But the interesting, I think, point when discrimination cases, as Sarah will probably know, here and in the UK, is they more than likely will settle. More than likely, after all the back and forth, they will settle, because corporate, and that could be a bad thing, because if they're not reported, then nobody knows what's going on. But you always have to think of the best interests of your client. The client wants to move on with their life, they want to see. So, but they more than likely settle.
Okay, so with that in mind, you mentioned that this had been a long-term exercise of various forms of harassment. For that person who's thinking about something that might have happened 5 years ago, is there a statute of limitations, as it were, on how aged these harassment claims could be before it gets thrown out as being sort of old news and we can't really do anything about it anymore?
Yeah, it's usually it's a limited period in most jurisdictions. It's usually 3 to 6 months as a max. But if you're able to show that there's a continuing act of discrimination, so there was something that happened then, and then you can turn the clock back, if you like, so you can say the most recent one was within time, it was within the last 3 months, but there's been a chain that's gone on for 3 years. And often claims are run like that, to say there's been a chain of discrimination, and those claims can be brought forward. Different equality acts will have different limitation periods in which to bring a claim. And just kind of going back to
unless it's a criminal point, unless it's a criminal complaint, was the point that I was going to make.
And just going back, Hazel, probably 90% of anything I've dealt with that's most horrific has settled, because employers cannot afford, and they've always said to me, sometimes I've acted for employers, right? And they've said, we can stomach an unfair dismissal claim, or kind of wrongful dismissal or breach of contract, but we get a discrimination finding against us. It goes to our, if they're listed shareholders, we're going to not get contracts, we're going to be in the public domain, we can't afford it. So they'll throw money at it. And sometimes, I'm not saying everybody has a price, but the money's too good to say no to, because it's in their interest that this never makes the light of day. So they throw a lot of money sometimes to settle them. But in terms of like horrific examples, I mean, there's awful ones I don't, without breaching confidentiality, about individuals who've been told things like, oh, you probably can't get conditioner for your hair, right? Maybe you've got dreadlocks. You probably have never washed with conditioner. Or, individuals who've been groomed by management, and they're trying to almost play mind games with this individual and make them believe that this is going to lead to promotions, and then trying to silence everybody in the office. I mean, it's often disgusting and harrowing.
Sure.
But as a lawyer, you don't have a personal view. You just get involved and do what you need to do. But unfortunately, you're then gagged and you can't really talk about what's going on because everybody's settled.
Sure. And as a judge, Natsai, this idea of everyone settling out of court, how does that make you feel? Because I'm sure, you're missing out on the juicy stuff. You want things to become case law. You want there to be a track record, presumably, so that laws are set in place and are removable, I'd imagine.
Do you know what? Because you've got different jurisdictions in the sense of different areas of law, this isn't something that applies to absolutely everything. So for instance, in the Crown Courts, you wouldn't necessarily have anything settling unless the prosecution withdrew its case. I think when it comes to settlement, it does depend on the jurisdiction and the good that's being served by it all. With employment cases, now I said to you that I haven't practiced employment law. I last did it many moons ago, but I understand from colleagues, because I was in a common law set of chambers, that this whole saving face thing, where you then don't have a precedent that helps other people, that's not a good thing. As a lawyer and in the judiciary, we must always remember that there is an individual behind any case. So whatever principle you're trying to establish, whatever policy is trying to be established, there is always somebody who's waiting for an outcome. And sometimes people just get really exhausted after a legal battle, that if something does settle, they're happy with that. And I won't talk about any particular cases. And I mean, I last practiced a few years ago, although I'm still a member of chambers, but you've got some cases where there could potentially be a class action, but the main litigant is exhausted. And this could be like awful stuff. It could be a discrimination. It could be something where their life was just, thrown off balance completely. But they're so exhausted. And although you know that the precedent has to be set so that others within the jurisdiction who know that this case will help them, you've got somebody who's exhausted. They are given a handout. They don't mind walking away from it. But when you start talking about other areas of law, and I don't want to introduce too much given our topic today, family law, for instance, if something settles, even if there's an important point of principle or policy affecting a broad spectrum of society, if you have vulnerable people involved or minors involved, for instance, a settlement and mediation is something that's always welcomed. So I think it's just important to look at the overall picture, and if there's an important point of principle that's going to be established that will help many people, then that's where the frustration comes in. And when people kind of keel over, that's not very helpful. When people face pressure from their lawyers to settle, that's not helpful. I don't mind, from a personal perspective, if somebody has been given frank advice and they've made the decision for themselves, as opposed to being pressurized into a position or anyone saving face. So yes, policy, public considerations are important, balanced against each individual and their own personal rights.
And your penultimate statement, Attilia, that was brilliant. Thanks, Natsai.
On what is perhaps the biggest discrimination issue that I faced in my time, we had our own Me Too movement within the company. A thread of emails was leaked, women sharing the experiences of sexual harassment in the organization. It was the most harrowing thing. Reading the stories was harrowing, and realizing that actually perhaps there have been some subtle experiences that I might have had, that I might have looked over actually, that were highly inappropriate and could also fall within the same bracket. Was a bit of a come to Jesus moment. And I think it was a shocking experience for the company, but also a good lesson, because it meant going back to the drawing board and overall, how did we become a place like this? And just the policies and the processes that clearly had been in place over years, but had been clearly ineffective because this had been happening in any case. And so it kind of going back and trying to fix that, which is not something that happens overnight, training people on what sexual harassment is, what it looks like, because that's an interesting thing. Imagine until that time, I had never been in a company where it had training on what sexual harassment is. So something happens and you're not even sure, is it sexual harassment? I mean, is it really appropriate for someone to stand so close to me when we're taking a group photo in the office? You know, what is it the massage thing you were saying? So passing by someone says, giving them a massage they didn't ask for. You know, little things like that, and particularly when it's young people still in an organization, coming into an organization, and those who have the least power in the organization, right? Imagine if they don't actually understand what is sexual harassment, what does it look like, what can you do if this happens to you, who do you speak to? Who are the people who are, you know, your safety, your security, who can then stand up for you and or take action against the perpetrator, etc. It was a big learning for me, and I think it was a good thing to see that it was mandated training across the organization. But still a lot of things to happen, obviously, a lot of steps to take because it still exists. Obviously it's still happening, but that was a big come to Jesus moment.
Yeah. Okay, so we're actually at the top of our hour. I would like to round off, if I may, with a very quick exercise, which is to say, if you were to give counsel to a client, a group of clients, a group of corporates or individuals around the most important consideration they need to make post the Black Lives Matter movement, what would it be? What do you think is missing in most organizations? And what takeaways would you want anyone listening to the show to think about as they go into this new chapter of discrimination, of inclusion, diversity, and all that goes with it?
I'd say you really need to understand and educate yourself first before you can seek to understand the plight of others. Don't assume what they're going through or what they know, or don't jump on the bandwagon of the popular media and say, oh, I care about all of this. What do you care about? What is your mission? What is your statement? What is your objective? So as a leader, as a corporate, in order to put that into practice, you need to have a statement. So it's stand for something or fall for everything. Know yourself before you go forward, because otherwise, if you don't have conviction in what you're doing and you don't know what you're doing, but you're doing it because it's the right thing to do, don't do it.
And your statement prompts me to think of the NFL, of L'Oreal, two organizations that took very distinct positions on all things Black Lives Matter, discrimination, and so forth, who've suddenly changed their tune because it's convenient to do so.
NFL apologized for doing the national anthem to go down against police brutality, and quite rightly they apologized, but it's sad that it had to get to this for that apology. So understand why you're doing what you're doing before you do it, and have conviction in doing or don't do it.
Wonderful, love that.
I think I'll just endorse that understanding and going back to open dialogue. People shouldn't just join the gravy train, is what I call it, without knowing exactly what you're going into. Understanding all of the issues that are involved is the only way you can support any change or any movement that's ongoing. But as I said at the outset, I will speak to the whole, the justice system as a whole, and just reinforce, and what I'd like people to take away from this is the eyes of the law are blind to all but the facts. And any constitutional democracy should protect the rights of its individuals, of its citizens. So that's the most important factor that I'd like people to bear in mind. And I think this also applies, although I'm speaking from the legal perspective, it applies to anyone who exists in any organization, any corporate existing in any jurisdiction must remember equality of treatment is something that can't be shied away from. And it shouldn't really take an event of such a magnitude as the most recent event for people to realize that they need to reconsider how they approach diversity and how they, approach the question of inclusion. But no tick boxing, proper understanding of all of the issues is important as far as I'm concerned.
Wonderful.
I love data. Maybe it's working in the tech space, but I almost feel like you can't track something you can't measure that you don't know. And I feel, and it's a little bit of understanding where is your company or organization at, right? As in, others have mentioned lived experiences, but it's also just simply understanding what is our demographic? Who do we have where? What are they doing? How do those people fare and or land up in leadership position? Is everyone landing up in leadership positions in, at the same rate? Are there things that are impeding others? I am all for numbers don't lie. And so I feel companies should try as best as they can to take a data-driven approach where possible to handling these type of issues, so that it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's not just because there's a Black Lives issue matter, it doesn't necessarily mean that your issue within your company is that Black people are the marginalized people. It might be a different demographic totally. So yeah, mine numbers don't lie.
Well, the fact that we've got all women on this panel, this is a demographic in its own right, right? Tenji, last but not least.
I'm all about transparency, communication with employees. I think the best organizations, certainly the ones that I've worked for, are the ones where there's just communication, open dialogue, and that brings in empathy. Once you communicate and understand the issues of your workforce, then you are empathetic, you know how to walk in your employees' shoes, you automatically brings in policies and procedures that will work, that will serve the workforce. So I'm all about dialogue and just open communication and fairness.
Thank you very much. Ladies, you have been absolutely incredible. I've loved having you on the panel tonight. My takeaway from this is that there is such a big role that corporates need to play, individuals need to play before the law needs to be invoked and get involved in these discriminatory matters. I do think that the responsibility sits with leadership in corporates. Let's have that diverse group. It's not enough to be diverse. It must absolutely be inclusive as well. Otherwise, quite frankly, there's no point. If anything, you're opening yourself up to litigation and to reputational risk and everything else that goes with it. To everybody who's dialed in today, thank you ever so much for joining us on Zoom In. You're always incredible. I've seen a lot of very well thought out comments come through, and I'm looking forward to reading through them after we're done. I would invite the panelists who are able to please jump on board, respond, give your personal attention, as you might have your areas of expertise cited in some of these comments. But thank you. And I hope we keep this dialogue going. I am hopeful that, by you being on the panel, you're able to actually generate business from people understanding what you do. We've got representation from Kenya tonight. We've got Dubai. We've got the UK. A judge, an arbitration specialist, an employment specialist, and a corporate lawyer. So thank you all so much for joining, and we will see you again, in fact, tomorrow night with our fireside chat, which is going to be yet another riveting discussion, I'm confident to say. All the best. Take care.